听众朋友大家好，欢迎收听阿榕伯胡说科技，我是阿榕伯陈良荣。今天这一集有点特别，我又找了晶片战争的作者塔夫茨大学国际史教授 Chris Miller 来上节目了。他上次上节目是1年多以前，那个时候川普刚上台，就请他讲一下川普就是对台湾科技业的影响该怎么因应这样子。那这一次为什么又找他呢？起因其实是因为2个礼拜前，那时候矽谷有一个很有名的创投他是 Groq 的那个早期投资人，他说呢台湾再过18个月就会失去半导体的战略地位，因为那个时候美国会建立完整的本土高阶晶片的供应能力，这个跟我们的认知很不一样嘛。还有川习会刚过很多事情在发生，所以我想说这个时候应该找 Chris Miller 来跟大家解读一下嘛，看美国人是怎么想。OK， 那因为我接下来在访问的时候可能问的会比较快用英文嘛，而且有点简略所以不好意思，所以在这个地方我先可能用中文跟大家解释一下下面的内容像最近华为他就说以后就不用管摩尔定律他们自己定了一个套定律，说你不用 EUV 就可以在2031年达到相当于 1.4 奈米的制程。那Chris Miller 就跟我说其实跟大家业界反应差不多啦，说其实他就是用垂直堆叠的方法嘛，其实就是先进封装台积电很早以前就开始做了。那为什么华为这个时候要拿这个出来讲呢？应该就是他认知到说如果再拿不到 EUV 呢，他们的制程真的是已经走不下去了。那但是又要让北京政府知道呢，中国的 AI 晶片还没有完蛋其实简单来讲，华为现在是在做大内宣这是我的解读。那另外我也问他说，那 EUV 那么重要那大家最近也发现说，其实中国能够卡西方脖子的东西好像越来越多嘛除了稀土还有锂电池的生产设备，然后我最近也发现在半导体制程非常关键，而且最近会越来越重要的人造钻石那整个产业链也是被中国垄断。那中国为什么不拿这些来换 EUV 呢？因为毕竟没有 EUV 他们就做不出来先进的晶片，你没有先进的晶片就做不出好的 AI 模型他们会觉得这样子 OK 吗？米勒的回答我觉得对我很有启发大家待会可以听一下。然后接下来我还问他一本美国的新书叫 Command of Commerce，他之前其实在他电子报介绍过那一本书，这一本书呢其实正好切中当今中国模式最大争议点就是说像电动车、电池、太阳能这些完全不考虑获利又拼命扩大规模这样子真的可以吗？如果只看获利其实中国在很多我们外面看起来很厉害的产业其实是二流国家，因为获利很低跟美国跟其他国家比差很远，所以其实是西方模式重获利中国模式重规模那这2个模式到底谁会赢这是个大哉问。那 Chris Miller 做了很深入的分析。那说到这里我要很感谢 Chris 就我在采访的时候跟他讲说你对台湾的境况很了解，然后他就说因为都看我的电子报，所以解释一下他是我胡说科技电子报的英文版的付费订户。那我英文版叫做 Tech Taiwan 在那个 Substack 的平台上架还不到1年。那 Chris 他很早就订了那还在他的电子报推荐我的电子报，所以让我的订户大增。所以各位听众，如果你还没有订我的胡说科技电子报的呢，麻烦看一下资讯栏连结，或者是直接 Google 胡说科技电子报我最近2期都会写最近最红的辉达的 VR200 以及 Computex。那最近一期写的是为什么 VR200 会传出 delay。 好，那我们现在欢迎 Chris Miller。Hello Chris.
Hello, good to see you.
Me too. So let me get back to the questions that we have discussed. Before that, Jensen Huang is in Taiwan right now, and he said that Taiwan is the epicenter of AI revolution. Chips, packages, and supercomputer ecosystem all happen here. It's quite different from maybe 3.5 years ago when your book, Chip, was published. At that time, people only talk about TSMC. But right now, people are talking more broadly, not just TSMC, but the whole ecosystem. So you might have the similar feeling because you already say that the electronic supply chain is becoming AI supply chain. So maybe we can elaborate that more from your perspective.
Yeah. So I think there are really 2 related epicenters of the AI revolution. Yeah. One is in Taiwan, the other is in San Francisco, where the AI model companies are headquartered, and both of these epicenters need each other, and they work in symbiosis. They work together. I think you're right to say that Silicon Valley's focus on Taiwan has broadened out from just TSMC, in part because the advances in AI chips and AI servers more broadly are not just about the silicon, but about the packaging and about the entire server design. And so a broader range of companies, from the electronics manufacturers to the materials designers, have become more essential, not just because they produce components, but because their components are part of the R&D process that lead to improvements, whether it's in cooling or in interconnects or in other aspects of AI servers. And so that has been, I think, very beneficial for the Taiwanese ecosystem, because it's put more Taiwanese companies in the position of being R&D forward and R&D critical, rather than just being component suppliers.
When did people notice that?
Well, I think that if there are kind of two main trends, trend one is advanced packaging, and then the second trend is the complexity of AI servers. Advanced packaging had been in progress for some time before the AI revolution, but it's been accelerated dramatically by demand for CoWoS and just in general, new packaging and interconnect capabilities. So it was being noticed slowly, but AI has just supercharged the advanced packaging ecosystem. And I think the AI server change really does date to the launch of ChatGPT in the 4 years since. As the number of components in AI servers has gotten so much larger, the cooling demands have gotten so much more sophisticated. All that has led to more focus on getting the right components inside those servers and having them exactly designed to meet the cooling or the other criteria that are needed for AI servers. So some of these trends were longer term in development, but they've really been supercharged since 2022.
Yeah. It's interesting that right now, I wrote my Substack newsletter this week that 15 out of 20 Taiwan's largest market cap companies 2 years ago is about 7 or 8. It's very big change for us. But I was curious why. Maybe normally we will think that the key material, key component company were mostly Japanese and Korean a few years ago. But right now it's more centered in Taiwan compared with the iPhone era.
Well, I think there are two reasons why. I think one is that TSMC has been driving a lot of the advanced packaging revolution. And so it's naturally drawn on companies that are in its own supply chain or nearby. And so the TSMC ecosystem has been a big growth driver. I think the second is that the companies that were involved in server manufacturing and assembly were also largely Taiwanese companies. And for some time, server assembly was not the most exciting business. It was low margin. But as servers have gotten to be really complex machines, that business has gotten much more valuable, because the know-how that's needed is growing every year, and therefore the margins that those companies can charge are also growing. And so the server assembly and server manufacturing business and server component business, that's been dramatically changed the last couple of years as server design has become really central to how we produce better AI hardware capabilities.
Wow, you really know a lot about Taiwanese supply chain. Are you working on your new book on that?
No, I'm just reading your Substack.
Thank you very much for you recommend my newsletter in your Substack. Thank you a lot.
But I learn a lot every week, so I appreciate it.
Okay, let me go back to the original question. Actually, the first idea I want to talk to you is the quote that Chamath of All-In podcast 2 weeks ago. He said that Taiwan will lose its strategic semiconductor importance within 18 months. At the first time, I was wondering why 18 months. So I think maybe it's the third fab of Arizona of TSMC. They say 2 nanometer maybe mass production at the end of 2027. Is a mainstream opinion?
No, I don't think so. And I don't think it's right. I think, if you look at TSMC's capacity expansion plans, it's true TSMC is building out the campus in Arizona, but it's also true TSMC is building a ton of new capacity in Taiwan. And so the share of TSMC capacity in Arizona or in Japan when the 3 nanometer fab there comes online is still going to be relatively small in comparison to TSMC's overall capacity. I think, there has been some increased optimism around Intel and Samsung in terms of competing with TSMC. But Intel and Samsung are moving from almost zero market share. Even if they each move to 5 or 10% market share, that still leaves TSMC the most important company by far in terms of producing advanced chips. And then, the third new variable is Elon Musk. who has his Terafab project. And the details around that are still very unclear, but it does seem like this is a serious initiative by Elon. And I think, it's never wise to bet against Elon, but the chip manufacturing business is the most complex in the world. TSMC is not a company that has been slow in innovation or been inefficient. Quite the opposite. It's extraordinarily fast in innovation and extraordinarily efficient. So it's not an easy business to disrupt, even for Elon. And so do I think TSMC is going to face a bit more competition in the future? I do. But TSMC today is in a position of having almost 100% market share. So it's not a wild prediction to suggest that it might face a bit more competition. But even still, I think that competition is going to leave TSMC the dominant player for some time to come. And certainly for the next 18 months, I don't expect any dramatic changes.
Yeah, but I think Chamath's quote representing one part of people were thinking that maybe we have to wait TSMC in Arizona to build up the capacity and Intel to build up the capacity, Samsung to build up the capacity until one day we don't have to care about Taiwan because US will become self-sufficient.
Look, I think, self-sufficiency for the US is a very, very long way away, a very, very long way away. And I think, our conversation about the whole ecosystem in Taiwan, not just TSMC, but the broader ecosystem becoming more important, makes it less plausible that the US will become self-sufficient. And so I've always been very skeptical whether political leaders talking about self-sufficiency or pundits like him. I don't think that's A, going to happen, or B, a reasonable goal. Just because of the depth of interconnection between the Silicon Valley and Taiwan ecosystem. So it's certainly true you can find people who will make statements about self-sufficiency, but I think the people who make those statements generally haven't spent a lot of time understanding the industry structure.
Okay, so even Chamath is, I think, is an early investor of one.
In Groq.
Yeah. So people think maybe he's a semiconductor expert.
Well, he clearly made a good investment in Groq, but I think, so I give him credit for that. But I think, the idea that in 18 months or in 3 years or in 5 years that the U.S. is somehow self-sufficient, I just don't see any evidence behind that argument.
Okay, thank you for saying that. And I want to talk about the recent paper by Huawei. There's a new law. I think he says he wants to replace the Moore's law, the Tau law.
Yes.
So what do you think of Huawei for speaking out about that right now?
So I think there have been influential figures in the semiconductor industry for over a decade who have been talking about the slowdown or the death of Moore's law. Jensen Huang has talked about the death of Moore's law. John Hennessy at Stanford is talking about the death of Moore's law. So I thought it was kind of puzzling for Huawei to argue that they had a new idea that Moore's law was slowing because that was standard knowledge in the industry. The argument they seem to be making is that different types of advanced packaging techniques can replace Moore's law. And that also seems to be standard knowledge. This is why advanced packaging processes like CoWoS have been so important. This is why everyone is exploring 3D stacking. There's not much new here from what I can tell. And so it seemed to me that actually the Howe's law concept was no different than what I've been regularly hearing about from the rest of the chip industry for over a decade. And so it seemed a lot more like PR than like any real new substantive announcements. And if anything, I think the interesting implication was that Huawei's not even counting on having traditional 2D scaling, presumably because the lithography capabilities won't be there. But this was reported by all the Western media as here's a new way Huawei will catch up. And it seemed to me to be actually the opposite, that Huawei is saying it's not going to catch up in traditional scaling, so it's just going to try to do the same thing that TSMC is already doing.
Yeah, Jensen said the similar things. He said that the TSMC already done that from 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, so the interesting question is why now? Maybe they think they gave up hope that multiple exposure can produce 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer. They might give up doing that.
Well, yeah, and it's been now 3 years since they first announced they could do 7 nanometer with multi-patterning.
Yeah.
And even there, the yields have by all accounts, been problematic, and they haven't announced a real 5 nanometer process. So I think it's clear that they're not going to be able to make real progress using multi-patterning. I think the other dynamic is, Huawei, they have an external audience in the rest of the world. They also have an internal audience in China with both Chinese users of their chips and the Chinese government. And I think partly they have to keep telling the domestic ecosystem, we are catching up, we are making progress, we are going to give you better chips. And so I think that's the other part of the public relations space that Huawei has to manage. And Tao's Law might be more about that than about speaking to external audiences outside of China.
Okay, it's another kind of propaganda.
Well, or marketing.
Yeah, marketing. Yeah. That's great. So I want to talk next question about the U.S.-China competition. Following the, President Trump's recent visit to Beijing, Johnson was called to come with them. So I kind of noticed that recent months, there's more choke points that China can do, from controlling the product, from controlling the upstream material and equipment. And, one time I talked CMP is a process of semiconductor processing.
Yep.
They use artificial diamond to polish the surface anyway. So the people told me that the artificial diamond is 90%. It's monopoly by Chinese suppliers in Henan province. And they not only control diamond, they also control the equipment. And the China government also want to ban the machine from export. So people outside China cannot buy the machine, the CVD machine, to build the artificial diamond. So I was surprised because artificial diamond is important not only in CMP, and in the future substrate might use diamond as a new material because the thermal property, something like that. So if they control the whole supply chain of diamond, so if US sanction on EUV, they can sanction on diamond.
Yep.
But they didn't do that. They only sanctioned part of the product. They didn't have full-scale sanction on diamond export. So I was wondering why that. They do have some checkpoints for the Western world, but they didn't use it very fiercely.
Yeah, I think there are a number of spheres on both the U.S. side and the Chinese side where there are certain monopolies or choke points that could be used that have not been used. On the U.S. side, there are certain types of chips, for example. You could imagine tighter controls on the exports of tools, on some of the materials that go into semiconductor manufacturing. And China's, of course, got its choke points as well. I think right now, coming out of not just this past summit between Xi and Trump, but also the Busan summit last year, I think both sides are happy with the status quo, with the truce, because both sides think that time is on their side, that in 12 months and in 24 months, they'll be in a stronger position than they are today. And the Chinese argument, I think, is to say, look, our manufacturing industries are expanding across the board. We're building out our semiconductor industry. We're building out our battery industry, our electric vehicle industry, et cetera. Chinese manufacturers are exporting around the world in increasingly high-tech products, whether it's like batteries or like biotechnology. China is doing better in many industries. And so Chinese leaders can reasonably conclude that they're going to be in a better position in 12 or 24 months' time, measured by progress across a range of industries. That's the Chinese bet. And the US bet is that, first off, the Chinese have demonstrated they have a uniquely powerful card to play with regard to rare earths, that it is powerful because there's so much value that sits on top of the production of rare earths. Rare earths themselves are a small industry, but the entire manufacturing base, from semiconductors to automotive to aviation, requires rare earths. But the US thinks that in a couple of years, it will have made a lot of progress, along with the Japanese and other countries, in bringing online new sources of supply. So the US is hoping that it's going to erode China's most important choke point, which is rare earths. And at the same time, the US thinks it's winning when it comes to AI. And it looks at Anthropic and its extraordinary growth over the last couple of months and says, Anthropic has 100 times the revenue of some of the leading Chinese model firms. It's being deployed very rapidly. Its Mythos model has these extraordinary cybersecurity capabilities, and that if the US keeps winning at AI, it'll be in a much stronger position in 12 or in 24 months' time. So both sides think they're winning. They're looking at different metrics, but I think that's why we have this truce that will remain for at least the next 6 or 12 months.
So the truth is that China is okay without EUV. They will stop at 7 nanometer. They were okay that they cannot build a good enough AI chip to train a good enough model. They were okay with that.
Well, I think if you asked ByteDance or Alibaba or Tencent, are they okay with that? Those companies would say no, which is why those companies are not only placing purchase orders for NVIDIA's H200 chips, which the Chinese government's not letting them fulfill, but those companies are also renting access to data centers outside of China, in Malaysia and elsewhere. So the private tech sector in China is not okay with that, but the government seems to be okay with that. It's not clear that Xi Jinping or the rest of the political leadership is that worried, in part because perhaps they're getting briefed about Tao's law and being told that they're going to catch up really soon. And I think that is a important gap between what the Chinese private tech sector wants and what the Chinese government is actually doing.
Wow, that's interesting. So let's bring us to our next question about the sustainability of this Chinese model. In your newsletter last month, you have mentioned the book, Command of Commerce. I haven't seen that, but the question is very interesting. Command of Commerce, Americans' enduring economic power advantage over China. It touches a very important question that we always wondering about. China builds so much capacity without making money, only by government subsidize. Is that sustainable? Some industry fail, but some industry thrive, like CATL, the battery giant. First, he has scale, and right now he had profit. So what do you take on that question? Because I think the book has a very good argument that although China might have 40% of global manufacturing capacity, a few years later, 40% of the world. That's a staggering number. But if you look at the profit, it's very low. It's second-tier nation. If we look at the profit, there's a very good graph that the author have produced. But if you look at the graph, then we were satisfied. Okay, China is far behind. But the feeling of the industry is not that. People are suffering. If you are competing with Chinese companies, you are suffering. So what do you take on this new perspective?
Well, I think it's a critical question to ask. I think in many industrial segments, China has been able to win market share, but has not been able to establish profitability. And in those sectors, China's market share growth is certainly bad for non-Chinese firms, but it doesn't really create these positions of dependency on China. So solar panels, for example, China is the dominant producer of solar panels, but it's not clear that that's really a politically powerful tool for China. If it were to restrict access to solar panels, other countries know how to make them at a slightly higher cost, but there's not a lot of leverage behind that. And so what we really should look for is places where China's not only won market share, but it's generated leverage as a result of that. And batteries are one space that do stand out, where you have CATL, which is got a $300 billion market capitalization. So it's a big, valuable company, and it's valued at that valuation because it can charge relatively high margins, and investors think it's going to be durable over time. And so I think one of the key questions is that an outlier? Or is that the trend? And should we expect to see more Chinese firms win market share, scale up, and because they scale, are able to create economies of scale and pour more money into R&D and build better products that give them a competitive moat over time? And I think that's uncertain, to be honest. I think batteries might be more unique than they seem. When it comes to other types of advanced manufacturing, like semiconductors and electronics, it's been harder for China to scale up and win key positions in markets across the semiconductor value chain. Where China's won market share, it's not won profitability in most cases, or at least outsized profitability. And so I think I remain to be convinced that China's got a lot of other industries like batteries where it's going to be able to develop this durable and profitable moat over time. So that doesn't mean that Chinese competition is not problematic for non-Chinese firms because it does depress profitability for the rest of the sector. It certainly is. But I think it does suggest that if China does win market share in more sectors, it's not obviously going to lead to more profitable Chinese firms in the long run. It could just depress profitability for everyone.
Yeah, solar cell and battery are two opposite examples of that. Nobody makes money in solar cell right now.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
But the EV is somewhere between those two types. And last year, EV looked likely to become next CATL. But right now, they were less profit. How do you think of BYD? BYD was very promising last year.
Yeah. And I think BYD still is a very capable company, and its profitability has fallen this year in part because of competition within the Chinese market, in part because of more competition and trade barriers in non-Chinese markets. I think with EVs, the key question that I have is, as we get more and more autonomous driving, where does the value actually get captured? And I think it's certainly possible that in 5 or 10 years' time, the hardware looks pretty commoditized, and it's the autonomy software that's the differentiator. Now, BYD could be a strong competitor there too, but it's less obvious that the manufacturing capabilities in terms of how to put together a car are going to be as central when we get more and more autonomous driving. And it could well be that actually the car itself becomes more commoditized, and it's the chips and the specialty hardware that enable autonomy, as well as the autonomous software, that is where more value accrues to. And if that's the case, then China's EV manufacturing base could find itself squeezed over the long run by their key component suppliers and by the software firms that actually and might end up making most of the money when it comes to cars.
Yeah, if that happens, so Tesla is heading the right way. Tesla is something like giving up manufacturing and to the sub-store.
Well, and that's that's Elon seems to be betting basically that making cars is no longer a great business for Tesla, and instead he's got to refocus on A, self-driving, and B, broader robotics capabilities.
欢迎回到阿榕伯胡说科技，我是阿榕伯陈良荣。我们继续来听跟 Chris 的访谈。So we follow go back to the claim of this book. Actually, he thinks that the profit is power more than capacity is power. So can you have an example of the US big company has a lot of profit and has huge influence?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the best examples is Apple. Which on the one hand has been in the news a lot over the past year after Patrick McGee's book, Apple in China, which shows just how dependent Apple has become on the Chinese supply chain. But Apple actually, it built this Chinese supply chain by moving capabilities from Japan and from Korea and from elsewhere to China. And so when you talk to Apple's suppliers, they realize they are less powerful and Apple is more powerful because Apple has the control over what goes in a phone, and Apple has the relationship with the end customer. And so that's a great example, I think, of where being the profitable part of the supply chain lets you dictate to other players in this supply chain. And so over long time horizons, over multiple years or a decade, profitable firms can really reshape their supply chains when they want to in a position that does illustrate their power. But I think there's different types of power and different uses of power. And it's one thing to say, can a company reshape its supply chain over a decade and bring in this supplier and cut out that supplier? And it's a different thing to say, can a government take advantage of a capability like China and rare earth processing and weaponize it to its advantage? Rare earths have never been a great business in China. It's not profitable. It's often not profitable because the Chinese government suppresses the prices, but it certainly has been an industry that's given China power. And so I think we should think a bit differently about corporations having power and what they do with that power versus governments having power. And there are cases where corporate power and government power don't always align because they have different interests that they're trying to achieve.
Thank you for the book, Apple in China. I wrote a very harsh book review about this book.
I saw that, yes.
You seem to agree with my side.
Well, I mean, So my take on the book, and I have great respect for the author. I think he's absolutely right that
he's done a very good job.
Apple, and I think the core claim that Apple has become too reliant on its Chinese supply chain and that it played a central role in building up the supply chain is true. I think the role of the Taiwan supply chain in facilitating that, Foxconn most importantly, is also underplayed in the book. And of course, it's in Foxconn and other facilities that all these components are brought together and manufactured in devices. I think the question that I have is, if you look into the Apple supply chain today, what you find is even in China, a lot of the factories are still foreign owned by Taiwanese or Korean or US companies. And so how Chinese is the supply chain really is an interesting question. And I think we're kind of seeing Apple test that right now as they explore, can they move some assembly and manufacturing to India or to Vietnam and other places. So it'll be interesting to watch how movable or not their supply chain is.
Great. And I'm moving to our next question. It's about drone. I heard there's a podcast of you and Jordan Snyder.
Yes.
About it's a very fascinating piece about drone. You speak with the Snake Island lady.
Yes.
She said that Ukraine and Russia all bought components from the same supplier in Shenzhen. I never heard of that.
Yep.
and they keep them from seeing each other.
Yep.
So when I heard that part, I cannot help to think the role that Taiwan can play in this dynamics. So you have been studying the drone supply chain, right?
I have, yes.
Yeah. And I have interviewed the drone company 5 years ago with my colleague. At that time, it's not for military use. It just want to replace the Chinese drone. They think there's a national security because drone has camera.
Yep.
So it is the beginning of the Taiwan-made drones. And it's interesting that drone is not a very difficult machine for Foxconn and the big companies, but they don't involve that. So there's only tiny companies. I don't want to call them company at that time because the government offer money. If you can make it, then we will purchase it because we don't want Chinese. Mm-hmm. We don't want the Chinese drone, and there's no other substitutes. So if you normally the quality is not very good, and the engineer's quality is terrible. I was an engineer. Sometimes I think maybe I can make my own drones because their quality is not as good as the other companies, maybe about the same level of my engineering expertise at that time. And later I saw this article in Economist. This year, there's a company called Kunwei. He makes 100% non-China drones and sold a lot of them to Ukraine. This one is one of the companies we interviewed 5 years ago. They are not very capable at that time. But right now it's becoming a big company by making these military use drones. So we were wondering, is that a sustainable business in Taiwan to make a China-free drone?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right to say that for Taiwanese industry, a drone is pretty simple. At least this kind of simple first-person view drones that Ukraine has deployed by the millions. In part because the drone is essentially just a smartphone with some motors on it. The key components are pretty similar. You need a battery, you need a frame for the drone, you need chips for the compute and the communications and the sensors, and you add some motors on top. And so the idea that Taiwanese firms can design and assemble these at quality seems pretty obvious. The question has always been the market, because DJI in China has been the dominant player since the origins of the industry. They've had these economies of scale. And although different governments have tried at times to create incentives for non-China production, until recently, these have been pretty small scale incentives, not at the scale you need to really compete with DJI. And I think that is now changing. It's changing because the Russia-Ukraine war has showed just the number of drones that modern conflict will inevitably require. And because of that, you had policy changes in a number of key governments. And so the US, as of last December, is essentially now banning Chinese drones and key components from China from the US market. And I think we're going to see Japan take similar steps, both in terms of restricting Chinese access to its civilian market, as well as buying a large number of drones for military use, and in Europe as well. There are moves in this direction. So there's a much larger market now than there was a couple of years ago for non-Chinese drones, both for civilian and for military use. I think the next question is, what's a non-Chinese drone? And there's a number of components where it's been difficult to scale up a non-China supply chain. One is batteries, because for most drones, the batteries come from China, given China plays the key role in the smartphone battery as well as the EV battery space. The second is the motors and the magnets inside the motors. And the magnets inside the motors generally require some volume of rare earths. And that's been a key choke point as well. And the third thing that's been interesting for me to learn about is certain of the chips and communications modules and sensors are actually better in China because DJI, for example, they have the scale to justify designing chips specifically for the use cases on drones. And so it's not that they have unique knowledge, but the scale enables them to do this specific design. And non-Chinese firms, at least for now, haven't had that scale. So I think it's, my personal view is that it's really important for the US and for Japan and for other governments to scale up their purchases of drones and to restrict access of Chinese companies to their market so that we do have enough demand from non-China countries to allow other companies to scale up. And I think Taiwanese companies are likely to do very well in that market given their existing expertise in electronics manufacturing.
It's interesting because a drone we used to think is like a dual use, like a product of DJI. Originally, it was designed for photography, but when it becomes bigger, it can bring it to the battlefield.
Yep.
And so you were thinking that the Taiwanese, maybe startups for drones, can accumulate profit from selling to the battlefield.
Well, I think that's true. I also think that, in the U.S. market, DJI right now it's not able to legally sell. Now, I think there will be some loopholes that they find.
Yeah,
but
they will
even for the
change it to different names.
Photography. Yeah, even for photography, there should be a space for non-Chinese drones now in the U.S. market. And, I think if you ask who's going to produce consumer drones more efficiently for the U.S. market, is it going to be U.S. firms or Taiwanese firms? I would say, Taiwanese firms have a pretty impressive track record in manufacturing consumer electronics.
I know a VC who invests in drones in China. Actually, he invests in the competitor of DJI, and then they changed their market to agricultural use. That's the story. And he told me that the importance of a drone is software.
I think the software point is key, but I also think we can't find ourselves in a position where we own the software and China owns all the hardware. And that's why it's so important to make sure we've got non-China manufacturers as well as non-China providers of drone software. And I think there's a debate in the market right now. Will you have different software and hardware providers for drones, or will you be better off with products that integrate the two, sort of like Apple does with the iPhone? And we'll see how the market shapes up. But I guess from a supply chain security point of view, we want both non-Chinese software and non-Chinese hardware for drones. And, you think about military uses, that's obvious, but you mentioned agriculture. The number of drones that are already used and will be used in the future in agriculture, in infrastructure inspection, in traffic management. These are going to be gathering just vast quantities of data, and making sure we've got reasonable protections around that data is, I think, very important.
So if I want to invest in a drone company, my worry would be that if the war in Ukraine ends next year and the market will vanish.
Well, I think right now the Russia-Ukraine war, it's still largely supplied by China. Now, the Ukrainians are assembling more of their drones locally, but the key components are still disproportionately coming from China. It's true for the batteries, true for the motors. And so actually, if you're a Taiwanese company, you're not depending on Ukrainian demand to a large degree. There are some, as I understand, some Taiwanese companies that do produce components that find their way into the Ukrainian supply chains, but actually not much right now. And so even if that war ends, I think there's still a lot of growth that is to come in the US market, in the Japanese market, in the European market, where right now it's all DJI, but that's going to change over the coming years.
Okay. Chris, I want to ask you what kind of industry you are more curious about right now related to Taiwan?
Well, I think that drones are important for the military reasons we talked about, for the data protection reasons we talked about, but they're also important because when you think about the world of physical AI that is just in the early stages of emerging, drones are one of the key places where we have millions of devices deployed that are already semi-autonomous and are getting more autonomous every day. And so I think robotics is going to be built on a foundation of drones and autonomous cars as the early use cases of widely deployed, fairly autonomous systems in the physical world. And so I think it's very important. I think it's important for the US, I think it's important for Japan, but also for Taiwan to think carefully about, as we get better and better physical AI systems, do we have control over the key nodes in the hardware that will undergird those systems? And right now I worry about that because I think when it comes to batteries and motors and certain types of sensors, China's a really strong player, and we don't want, as we use more and more robots, we don't want what's already happened in electric vehicles and CATL, we don't want that to replicate itself in the robotics world as we use more robots. And so that's an industry where I think policymakers and businesses in Taiwan and Japan and the US and Korea are not really thinking enough about some key choices that we make about how those supply chains are structured. But they'll be very important choices as we use more physical AI systems.
So what's the situation right now as you see it? The cheap Chinese drone are winning over the market? We always think that Tesla is better. Is that?
Well, I think for robotics broadly, it's still too soon to tell. But I worry if China keeps winning in drones, if China does win in autonomous cars, which is uncertain, Elon might win, but if China does win, that would put China in a very strong position to win across different types of robotics. And so I think we should be very careful about those decisions and make sure we're doing enough to support our own physical AI ecosystems as they're growing so that they're not dependent on China as they do grow.
Yeah. Last time I talked to a Japanese VC, I asked them, in my childhood, all the advanced robots is manufactured and dreamed about Japanese. How come there's no Japanese robot in the market right now comparable with the Chinese?
Yeah, I think it's a key question. And there still are places where the Japanese supply chain has better capabilities than China. So precision motors, for example, high reliability motors, which you need in any sort of robotic movement. The Japanese firms are still better there. But I think you're right to say that the Japanese robotics industry as a whole hasn't really adjusted to a new world of AI plus robotics. And I worry that even if Japanese products are a little bit better, if China is able to combine them with AI more quickly, that can give China an advantage.
Okay, thank you very much for having your time in France to talk to us.
This is fun. Always fun to catch up.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
好，谢谢 Chris 今天的精彩采访。再提醒一下各位听众，还没有订我的胡说科技电子报的，麻烦看一下资讯栏连结，或者直接 Google 胡说科技电子报。阿莫胡说科技下次更新时间是7月2号，请听众朋友准时收听。记得在 Apple Podcast 追踪听天下，给我们5颗星。有什么想胡说的，也欢迎留言给阿荣伯。我们下次见，拜拜。